and welcome to my October reading wrap-up. I read 19 books in October, 12 of which were from my physical TBR, so that's pretty dope, and I'm just going to get right into it because this is going to be a lengthy video. The first book that I read for October was Sweet Valley Confidential 10 Years Later by Francine Pascal. This is a, I think, young adult? I don't know. This is a continuation of the Sweet Valley series in its many incarnations. This takes place 10 years after high school when they're 27 and Elizabeth is living in New York, Jessica's living in Sweet Valley. They've had a big fight and there was a big betrayal, and now the book kind of follows them in their drama, as you know, it always did. I read this for the lowest books on my TBR video that I did and will link down below. I gave this 2 stars. Didn't expect to like it, but the thing with the Sweet Valley books was that they were always drama filled and they were always kind of ridiculous and not the best written, but they were always so much fun, and this book was not fun, unfortunately. I really expected to have like more of a good time reading it than I did, but it was very bitter and very just like unhappy people. Everyone was cheating on their significant others and it was just weird. And then the drama that happened, which I'm going to say because it was revealed very quickly into the book, I don't think it's a spoiler. Jessica slept with Elizabeth's boyfriend that she'd been with for 10 years about. So that's the drama between them, and it's like, that's not, you can't just come back from that, you know? Like, there's one thing to like steal your sister's boyfriend when you're 15, and it's another to steal your sister's boyfriend when you're 27 and they're engaged. Like, it wasn't fun. I really just needed this to be fun for it to work. And also, like, the writing was not great. It was never great in the original various series, so I wasn't expecting that. There were a lot of flashbacks, like a lot of this book was told in flashbacks, and I don't know how much of those flashbacks were like flashing back to different points in the series that were in other books, or if they were just made up flashbacks. And also a lot of this was like recapping and catching up, like what's happened to these characters in 10 years. So if you're like really invested in the series, you were a big fan and you want to like see where it went and see what happened in people's lives as they're an adult or as they're adults, you might want to check this out just for like curiosity's sake. But it was kind of an unpleasant read. It was kind of like unhappy and bitter, and like it ends the way you would expect it to end, you know? I don't want to like spoil anything, but it doesn't have any real surprises in it. It's just like a little bit too bitter to follow a series that I had enjoyed as a kid. The Almost Moon by Alice Sebold, which I gave 4 stars. I actually really enjoyed this. Everyone hates this book, but I found it fascinating. This is an adult contemporary about a woman who kills her mother who's suffering from some kind of dementia. She just murders her one day, and it's kind of just following her in like the day or so, I think like the 24 hours after the murder, and it's really like uncomfortable. The main character is really like petty and judgmental and just like really unlikable overall, and I enjoyed that. Like, I enjoy when a character is made genuinely unlikable, but not in a villainous sort of way. Like, she's not trying to be a bad person. Like, I never get the vibe that she's like mean or anything. She's just kind of an unlikable person, and she gets like so caught up in her own head and her own dramas that she kind of forgets her actions affect other people sometimes. And it was really fascinating and also just like unpleasant. Like, I know it's weird to say when I'm talking about like enjoying this book, but it was so unpleasant and everyone was so unlikable, and it was just like a good time. Like, I don't think this is a book for everybody because like it does have like weird graphic moments where she's like, she washes her mother's body after she kills her, and it's like really graphic in that sense, like not in terms of like gore or anything. It's just graphic in terms of like there's a lot of uncomfortable things that are being written and a lot of uncomfortable descriptions, and Alice Sebold doesn't shy away from that at all, and like I liked it. If you like books with really like unlikable characters, they're just like uncomfortable and unpleasant, like you might give this a go. It has terrible reviews, like so bad. Everyone I know hates this book, but like it was a good time. I gave it 4 stars and just like enjoyed it. Then I read The Wilderness of Ruin, A Tale of Madness, Fire, and the Hunt for America's Youngest Serial Killer by Roseanne Montillo. This is a nonfiction true crime book about a boy who committed murders in the 1800s, late 1800s, 1870s. He was basically considered to be the youngest serial killer. He murdered other children younger than him. He started out with like tortures and then like progressed to murders. He got caught at one point and then released, and this is about him. I gave this 2 stars. This was an odd book. Like, I didn't hate it, and there was a lot of worthwhile information in it. So if you're interested in, what was his name? Jesse Pomeroy. He was the killer. If you're interested in him, I think you would learn a lot about him from this book, because like I did, and it was interesting in that way. But this book was so disjointed. There was so much unnecessary information, and I think it was intended to be in like an artistic way. Like, she was trying to capture more of like the world and the history and the culture and just like have it really be like this big piece, and it wasn't. Like, it didn't work at all. I remember there was one instance at the very beginning. She was telling a story about Jesse's mother and how she had 2 birds, and like the birds made her happy, and like he's a serial killer, so I guess you can make a guess what happens to the birds. But like in the middle of this story about the birds, Montillo stops and just goes on this very long description of like the prison that's nearby. That has nothing to do with anything at this point. Jesse's like 7. And then like after a page or 2 of talking about the prison, she just cuts right back into the story about the birds, and it was so random and weird. And like that happened throughout the book. There was just tons of random information. And then there was a really big thing in this book about Herman Melville. Like, I think there were like 3 chapters solely dedicated to Herman Melville, like author of Moby Dick, Herman Melville. He never had any interactions with Jesse Pomeroy. He frequently wasn't in the same location as Jesse Pomeroy. He didn't like have anything to do with him. His story didn't relate to his in any way. Like, I don't understand why he was included in this book. And it wasn't like bad information. It was just like 3 random chapters talking about him, which was fine. But it was the kind of thing where like I was so confused why. Like, it didn't make sense. There was just a ton of random stuff here. And like it was fine information. Like, I think if you're really interested, you could get a lot out of it. But like, I don't know, it was way too random for me, and there was just way too much going on. Like, had this book been edited down into something a little bit more manageable and like more, I don't know, more just like stick to Jesse Pomeroy and his life, because there was enough information there to like cover it. But I didn't really enjoy this. Journey from the Land of No by Roya Hakakian. A girlhood caught in revolutionary Iran. This is about Iran in the 70s, especially during the revolution of 79. It's nonfiction, it's her memoir. It's just like telling the story of what it was like for her growing up during that time period, especially because she is Jewish, and like the Jewish population in Iran is very much a minority population, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time. So I gave this 3 stars. This was fine. This was very interesting. Like, definitely like an interesting story, and I really enjoyed hearing about it and just like hearing about her life. I've read a couple of books about Iran, and I think that helped, because had this been my first, I don't think she really did a great job of including all the political information that was going on at the time. And when I say all, I don't mean like, I didn't expect this to be a book about the political revolution and the uprising and how things were changing. It's very much about her, but she doesn't include a whole lot of context for things. Like, she'll talk about some big things, some small things, but not really connect them. And at a point, there were several time jumps, so it would just skip several years, and it seemed to be like several very important years. So I am glad I had read other books prior to this, because otherwise I would have been very confused, I think. But it was really interesting. Like, I loved hearing about her story. So I would definitely recommend it, like, just for that, you know? Like, it is an interesting story of someone growing up at a very, like, major political upheaval in time, because a lot of things changed, and it was just interesting. Like, it was a very interesting story. I do think her writing style a little bit too flowery for me, but I recommend this. Definitely, like, I think you should know something about Iran in the 70s and the 80s if you're going to pick this up. Like, I think you'd have a hard time if this was your first read, but definitely a good one. The Boy Who Dared by Susan Campbell Bartoletti. This is a middle grade historical fiction book that is based on a true story. Helmuth Humaner was a German schoolboy as the Nazis were coming to power, and essentially he joined the Hitler Youth because it was mandatory at the time, and his stepfather, he was an important person. Not like important, but like higher up than the average person. Not that it matters. And as time went on, Helmuth kind of realized, like, this is a bad thing. Nazis are bad. Like, we should do something about it. So he started printing, like, brochures and stuff to, like, hand out. And eventually he was put to death. Like, he was the youngest person put to death by the Nazis who was, like, not in the camps, like, legally put to death, you know, and executed. And it's a really interesting story. Like, this made me want to pick up more nonfiction about this because I never read about him before. But I give this 4 stars. This is a really good middle grade book. Would definitely recommend. It's really dark for like children, but like it is written in a way that like children could easily follow this, and it was just like a good story. I've read Bartoletti before, and she always writes really well. She wrote some middle grade historical fiction diaries, which I love, like the Dear America series and all that. She wrote one that was particularly good. This was just like a really solid historical fiction middle grade book. It alternated between like his time in prison and what he was experiencing because he was in prison for a long time before his execution, and also like memories, like how he got to where he is, what he specifically did and how he got caught. And it was just like interesting. He was caught with 2 other boys because he was like a teenager when this happened. I think he was like 18. He was caught with 2 other boys who escaped with their lives, and both of them have written books about it, and I would be really interested in finding those books because it is the kind of thing where like when I read fiction now that's based on true events, I would generally just prefer to read nonfiction about those events because I just find myself wondering like what really happened, like what is the artistic license she took, like how much did she change. And it's just like, you know, it is a novel, it is fiction, it's like based on him, but it's not literally about him, and I struggle with that. But this book is like a really close retelling from what I read and the research I did after, so would definitely recommend if you're into this kind of thing. Then I finished my first audiobook of the month, which was The Witches, Salem 1692 by Stacey Schiff. This is a nonfiction book about the Salem witch trials. It's really interesting. It's really long. Like, I mean, I can't really describe it more than that. It's just about the witch trials, like everything that led up to it, all the people involved. Like, it's a lot. It's a lengthy book. I gave it 3 stars. I don't think it was a bad book. I think it was like quite well done, actually. But, well, first of all, I didn't love the audiobook. I think it was too dense for me to listen to via audiobook. It was definitely like, I probably should have read that physically, and I don't think I'll listen to another Stacey Schiff book. But also, I didn't love the narrator. She had a very, like, dramatized take on this book, and because it's nonfiction, and because it is just, like, historical nonfiction, like, it's very just, like, fact-based, I would have preferred, like, a drier narration. Like, I know that sounds bad, but, like, I would have. But yeah, it was just too dense, and I found that, like, I was struggling to follow everyone who was involved because there were a lot of moving pieces in this book. There were a lot of people. There were a lot of people with similar names. It was really hard to follow. And also, I am just not that interested in the Salem witch trials. Like, I think it's an interesting point of time, but for reading, like, I don't know how long this book was. It was like a more than 20-hour audiobook. But for how long it was, I just don't have that much interest in the Salem witch trials and like everything that went on. And the questions I have are the questions that can't be answered by history. Like, why did the girls do it? Like, what was going through their heads? How many people believed it, like truly believed it, or were just caught up in like I have to believe it because I don't want to be the next person accused. And it's like, there's some of that in this book, but like most of those questions just like literally cannot be answered. Like, we don't have that information. It can't be found. So I feel like this is one of those things I would rather read fiction about, because you can really get into like the morals of it and the details and like what's going through people's heads. So yeah, I would recommend this if you're like really interested in the Salem witch trials, because it was very information heavy. There was a lot. I learned so much from it, even like not being able to follow everything. But I think at the end of the day, it was just like too much for me. Like it was more than I was really interested in, if that makes sense. But it was a really well done book. Just like, I probably wasn't the reader for it, especially as an audiobook. Then I read The Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James, which I also gave 3 stars. This is a horror / thriller adult book about a woman who was kidnapped as a child and managed to escape, and now she's an adult and she has a lot of trauma, PTSD from this kidnapping, and she is investigating an old murder that happened in her town, and a woman who was charged with the murders but eventually exonerated, and people generally tend to assume that she was still involved in those murders even though she was found not guilty. She also, in addition to investigating this specific crime, runs an entire website about true crime and cold cases and things that haven't been solved. So very interesting premise. I really liked some aspects of this book. Like, the writing style was great. I really loved the main character. What was her name? Did I write down her name? Shay. Shay was the main character. I loved her. I loved her story. And I really enjoyed kind of learning about her past and the kidnapping that happened when she was a child and how that affects her and her relationships with the people around her. Like, really well done. Like, half of this book was basically about Shay, and that was the half that I loved. And then the other half was about Beth. And Beth was the woman who was accused of 2 murders like 40 years ago or something. And you get Beth's perspective and you get Beth's backstory, and I did not care about Beth. And I don't know how much of this was like how she was written, who she was as a character, and how much of it was that this was the part of the story that was kind of horror-based and supernatural. And I knew going in that Simone St. James writes supernatural, but I struggle so much with that. I figured since she gets good reviews, I would try it. Like, because I really want to like branch out and like read things I normally don't, but I just do not enjoy supernatural in stories and like books that are supposed to be like kind of realistic. Like, if it's like a straight fantasy thing, like Supernatural, the TV show, like that is just fantasy. I can do that. But when it's like kind of supposed to be more realistic, it's like, it bugs me. It just irks me. So I don't know if it was that. I couldn't get into Beth. I couldn't enjoy her sections. I never cared. I was always really excited to get back to Shay. And it was just really unfortunate because I do understand why Simone St. James is loved. I think she's just not for me. So this is a book I would wholeheartedly recommend. It's just not really my thing, unfortunately. The Boys of My Youth by Joanne Beard. This is a collection of essays, just basically about her life. I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed this. I think with any collection, it's definitely a bit hit and miss. Like, there were some essays in here that I loved that like hit me so hard emotionally. Like, one of them made me cry, like at work. Like, I was sitting there trying not to cry and it was just so sad. And some of them were very like overwritten, overlong, very meandering, like kind of purposeless. Like, I didn't enjoy them. I was reading them just to get through. So I gave it 4 stars because the ones that I loved, I really, really loved. And I think the book was highly worth it for that. They've been published other places because this is a collection of essays. So I wanted to list the ones that I really, really loved. The Fourth State of Matter is an essay, her most famous essay. It's about the shooting at the University of Iowa that happened in the 90s. She was working very closely there. She just happened to not be there on the day that the shooting took place, but like the victims were like her close colleagues who she knew very well. Also, Out There and The Boys of My Youth were the other 2 that I really enjoyed. But The Fourth State of Matter, like, Go read that if you like essays, because that was amazing. Like, that was a fantastic essay. Like, not only is it about the shooting, but it also details like her elderly dog who's kind of like ailing and like is getting to the point where he's not gonna make it much longer, and it like intertwines those two things together really well, where like more of the essay is about like the dog, but like the emotional impact comes from the shooting. And it's just like, I don't know how to describe it, but it was really well done the way she like interwove those two plots, and like the one that had less time on the page was the more meaningful one, and it worked so well. She did that in a few of the essays, and just like, she's a great writer. Like, if you like creative nonfiction like this, I honestly can't recommend this book enough. But even if you're not super into it, go look up The Fourth State of Matter, because that was an amazing essay. The Snowman by Jo Nesbo. This is an adult fiction thriller about a detective who gets a case of a missing woman and finds out that this case is tied into other cases of missing women over the years, and he needs to find the person who has been probably killing these women and why. So this is the 7th book in the Harry Hole series. This is the only one I've read. I did a review on this that I will link down below, but I gave this 2 stars. I didn't like it. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I have that whole review if you care. It's like 15 minutes of me complaining about how sexist this book is, because every woman in this book, every female character was treated so badly, like by the narration. They were either victims or like treated as whores, which was his word that I'm using, that was used by a number of characters. They were all like sexually deviant in some way, and I don't just mean like they just happened to be, but they were looked down upon for that, and it was every single woman in this book. And it was super gross. But beyond that, it was just a very like excessive story. Like, so much happened. Like, there was very little investigating that went on. It was all just kind of like, look at that person probably did it, let's arrest them and see what happens. And they must have arrested like 6 or 7 different people for this crime over the course of the book. And by the time you get to the end, it's like, you know who it has to be because they've arrested everyone else. Like, there is no one left. And it was also like pretty obvious who it was going to be from the beginning, but not a fan. It wasn't like the worst thing I'd ever read, and I'd probably be like less negative on it had it not been so sexist. So I kind of just get the vibe that Jo Nesbo hates women. There are better thrillers out there. I would not recommend this one. Then I listened to White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by DiAngelo. This is a nonfiction book basically about how white people react to when things are accused of being racist, or when they are accused of being racist. And it's basically just discussing how that's a harmful mindset to have, and like how when a person of color, points out that you were doing something racist, instead of becoming defensive about it, you should like reflect on yourself and like really think about why, and like be open to that kind of criticism instead of becoming very defensive. Invig is much better than I make it sound. I was just struggling with describing that book, but I gave this 4 stars. I think it was really, really helpful. Like, it's definitely one I would highly recommend to other white people. It really does like force you to look at yourself and like really reflect on your own behavior and what you do, and like the racist things you do and the racist preconceptions you have, and like how to start addressing those within yourself, which I think is very important. Like, it's not really about like society as a whole. I mean, it is, but the book specifically is trying to get like the specific reader to like reflect upon their own issues and like internalized racism, like unintentionally so, but like you're still being racist. And I found it really, really helpful for that. I did knock it down a star because parts of it were very repetitive. It did feel like she was repeating not only the same points, but like the same literal lines. I remember it cropping up a couple of times, and I also wish it had been like more researched and more detailed, because a lot of this book was about like the ideas and like the general concepts, which was very helpful. Like, don't get me wrong, like it was really, really helpful for me, but I wish it had been more researched and had like more facts and more statistics and more just like information, because the way she spoke, it seemed very clear to me that she has done the research. Like, it was there. It was just like she didn't include a lot of like the information. It was more just about like general beliefs, and it was like, yes, do your own research, but I kind of wish there'd been more. Like, it could have been a much longer book, and it could have been more detailed and more helpful. I would have appreciated that, but I think still a very, very worthwhile book, and I highly recommend. I found it helpful for me personally, and I think a lot of other people would as well. Then I read The Ghost at the Table by Suzanne Berne. This is an adult fiction contemporary about a woman who decides to go home for Thanksgiving. Essentially, she is having Thanksgiving with her sister and her sister's husband and their children, as well as her estranged father and some other friends that are at the Thanksgiving table. I gave this 3 stars. I was very confused by this book. Like, it's a very slow-paced, character-driven, kind of nothing book, and I don't mean nothing in a negative way. It was just like, nothing happened, there was no good conclusion. It was just like, it was what it was. And I like that. Like, I like that kind of book. With this book, I'm not sure it worked. Like, sometimes I was reading it and thinking that I was really, really enjoying it. And like, I loved this. I think it was so well done. And then other times I was reading it and it was like, I don't know how much I'm enjoying it. Like, I don't think this is a very good book. And it was just such a weird thing because like, I genuinely don't know. So I went with 3 stars because that was kind of a middle ground. But sometimes I was like, I'm loving this. And sometimes it was like, I think this is kind of trash. And all the characters were so annoying, which was really interesting. Like, they were all kind of like normal people. Like, none of them were like out of the world, like wild. They were just like normal people, kind of annoying. Like, the white college girl was very pretentious and like very like in her own like space and thinking she was a better activist than she was. And they invited like a graduate student and a couple of like the father's work friends, and like there's a younger daughter, and the main character was from California, and she was a writer of children's books and was very obsessed with Mark Twain and like the parallels between Mark Twain's family and her family, and she was very unpleasant and unlikable. And I enjoyed that, but at the same time, like, sometimes I didn't. I don't know. It was weird. Like, I'm not sure about my feelings here. Not one I'd recommend to many people, but like, if you're curious, it was a weird one, and I didn't think it was bad. There was also some racism in this book that I was never quite certain how I felt about, because I don't know if it was intentional or not. Like, part of me thinks that it was. Like, it felt intentionally written, especially with the main character she wasn't supposed to be likable. She was supposed to be kind of like strange and have weird beliefs and like things that happen. But I could never tell if like the racism was written in intentionally or if it was just like existing, you know? So I didn't know how to handle that. It was never addressed, and I think I did kind of fall on the side of, I'm reading this as though it's intentional, but I'm not sure. And I do think it should have been addressed, like, because of the way it was written. It was all small things, but it was things like she would have a conversation with this African-American student, and she was talking about Mark Twain, and he was like, yeah, like, I kind of have some issues with Mark Twain because of how racist his books were. And she was like, oh, but that's a mistake people make, is criticizing him by today's standards. And it's like, okay, like, that's a conversation to have, but like, it's very uncomfortable and racist to just tell like this 18 or 19-year-old kid, that this black kid, that he shouldn't feel uncomfortable by Mark Twain's racism. And I don't know, there were a number of things like that, and I don't know, I wouldn't really recommend this book, but it was odd. I'm not sure how I felt. That was a bad part of the wrap-up, but okay. The next thing I read was They Do It With Mirrors by Agatha Christie, my very first Agatha Christie book. I gave this 3 stars. This is a cozy mystery. It's Agatha Christie. I think we all know who Agatha Christie is, but essentially this is a Miss Marple book, and Miss Marple goes to visit an old friend because one of her other old friends is worried about this friend. So she goes there, and like, there's a lot going on. There's a murder that happens, and there's a potential poisoning plot, and there's a lot of drama. It was fun. It was cute. It was a nice cozy mystery. The story kind of did nothing for me, like the actual plot of like this particular murder and mystery, but it was fine. Like, it definitely gave like the good cozy mystery vibes, so I understand why people like her. The thing I struggle with here, and why it kind of got a lower rating for me, was because there's a lot of racism in this, and classism, and sexism, and just like in general prejudice, and it was just like kind of unpleasant to read. And I mean, if you read any older book, you come across that in some form or other, which, like, I understand. And there is something to be said for reading these books despite that. But for me, the point of a cozy mystery is, like, the cozy vibes you get from it. Like, it's not, you know, the character or the stories or the social commentary, it's like the cozy vibes. So when I'm reading that and they just drop all kinds of prejudice and slurs, it's like that really ruins the vibe, and it's like, then why else would I be reading this? And I kind of fell on the side of like, I would rather read a contemporary cozy mystery, get those cozy vibes, and not have to suffer through the prejudice that's like ruining my vibes. So I don't know, I'll read more Agatha Christie. I have more of her books on my shelf, but like after this one, she's not really going to be a go-to for me. Then I read a series, my favorite series that I have read so far this year. Like, maybe my favorite books that I've read so far this year. I'm gonna talk about all of them at once, even though I read like a book in between, but we'll just go with all of them. And that is the Echo Company series by Ellen Emerson White. The first book, Welcome to Vietnam. The second is Hill 568. The third is 'Tis the Season, and the fourth is Stand Down. This is a quartet of young adult historical fiction novels about the Vietnam War, and they center around, I'll hold up this one. They center around this one particular squad within Echo Company, and the main character, Michael, who was drafted into Vietnam. He doesn't want to be there, and he is fighting because he has to. And basically that's what most of his squad mates are too, and it just follows them and their journey and the battles and the losses and the trauma and the sadness and like the general discomfort of being at war. I gave every book in this series, I gave books 1, 3, and 4 5 stars, and then I gave the second book, Hill 568, 4 stars, which was largely just because this book was a lot more like combat and military focus, like they all clearly are, like it's a military series, but this one was a lot more like specific battle focus, combat focus, military information, and I just wasn't as into that, which is just like personal taste. I don't think it was a worse book. I think I just struggle with that kind of story and that kind of focus, so not for me. The rest of them were 5 stars though, because this is wonderful. I cried for every single book at least once. It was wonderful. I love the main character, Michael. He's so funny, he's so clever, and he's so just like likable. Like, that's what Ellen Emerson White does so well, is creating this cast of characters who are all so different and have like flaws and like good traits and like everything, but they're all really likable even when they're doing bad things, and like it makes me so happy. And there's a lot of commentary on Vietnam in this book too, about like what they're doing and like the things they're doing on that are like, you know, negative things over there, and how like most of these boys who are fighting, these teenage boys who like just got out of high school, don't want to be there and don't believe in what they're fighting for. And at one point Michael had a conversation with his lieutenant and was like, I feel like a Nazi here, like this is how I feel, and like had an honest conversation with the lieutenant. And it was just like really interesting. In one of these books, they made a comment about how there's so much Kool-Aid, like more Kool-Aid than coffee, because most of the boys over there are children, you know, like they're 18, 19 years old, and like they're basically children. They don't like coffee. I don't know. It just, I cried so hard for like all of these. Like I just bawled my eyes out. They're wonderful. The third book was a little bit of a departure because the third book is about a different main character, and it's not so much about the squad. It's about Rebecca, who's a nurse in Vietnam, and she's the main character, and she was like just introduced for this book. A little bit like jarring to get into, but like love her story. My sole complaint about these books is that they ended and I wanted to read more. Like 5 stars for this series, like 10 out of 10. I love Ellen Emerson White. These say Zack Emerson, but that's her pen name for these. They're really wonderful. Like, I genuinely just, if you like historical fiction, middle grade stuff about Vietnam, I can't recommend these enough. They're so wonderful. Like, she wrote a companion novel for them that, like, I'm just so desperate to read because it sounds amazing and it's supposed to be so good. But, like, these broke my heart, like, every 40 pages. So I highly, highly recommend. Like, just, like, stunning, wonderful, amazing books. Read them. Then I read Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. This is an adult thriller about a married couple who go on a weekend trip to Scotland from London, and essentially it's just like them on that trip, and bad things start happening, and it's told in multiple perspectives between the husband, the wife. Letters the wife is writing to the husband from the past, and a random mysterious woman who is probably doing the bad things. It's a weird book. I gave it 2 stars. It's not like the worst thriller I've ever read. Like, I understand why people would like Alice Feeney, but I just found everything in this book so annoying. I wasn't down for the ride. I didn't like anyone, and not just that I didn't like them, because clearly, like, from the other books I've enjoyed, I like when I don't like characters, but I just found them annoying. Like, I didn't want anything from them. Like, I didn't care what was happening to them. I wasn't invested in their backstory. I was just, like, kind of over it. And, like, I also struggled a lot with the information she was giving out and how she was, like, sharing information. Because with thrillers, so much is withheld. Like, so much information is withheld. You don't really know what's going on for a lot of the book. And you kind of have to take things at face value as it's, like, slowly revealed. And, like, there are plot twists and, like, you learn new things constantly. And I felt like she withheld too much information for too long. Like, it got to a point where I just did not care. I was like, I don't know anything about what's going on. Like, 150 pages into this. I'm so confused. I don't care. And I just, like, kind of checked out. And by the time she revealed the information, it was like, these are really cool plot twists. Like, the plot twists were really well done. Like, if you're someone who enjoys, like, good plot twists and thrillers, and that's kind of your driving force for reading them, you would probably enjoy this book more than me, because there were a lot of, like, really interesting, cool plot twists. But it just took so long to get there, and I didn't care about the characters or the story, and it was so annoying to me, and I was just kind of, like, checked out. So this was not for me. And then there were a lot of little annoying things too, just like small things that really didn't matter at all, but that bugged me. And this, I just found it, like, so annoying. And then I read 438 Days, An Extraordinary True Survival at Sea by Jonathan Franklin. This is a nonfiction book about a fisherman who was adrift at sea for 438 days and survived. And he's the only person in known history, or he's the only person that we're aware of, who's survived more than a year at sea in a small boat. Because it was, like, a very small boat. It didn't have, like, sails or a mast or oars. Like, his motor died during a bad storm when he was, like, 15 miles off the coast. And then he got, in the storm, he got pushed out to sea, like, 1,000 miles off the coast of Mexico. And then wound up drifting all the way around to, like, the Pacific Islands, which is wild. So yeah, over a year. I gave this 4 stars. It was really interesting. Like, I have very little to say about this book. Like, it is what it is. If that story sounds interesting to you, you will probably like this book. It's just about, like, his time being adrift at sea and what he did and how he survived. And it's very interesting. I do think it was paced very well, because with long-term survival stories, there's a lot of boring stuff, you know? Like, a lot of it is just him doing the same things over and over. Like, he just caught birds and ate raw bird meat. He caught fish and ate raw fish meat. And, like, that was what he did for 438 days. But it was paced really well, so, like, it did cover everything he was doing without feeling like it was just jumping through time randomly. But it kept your interest and, like, kind of, like, slimmed down on the boring bits. So, would recommend if you're into this thing. And if not, you probably wouldn't like it. Like, it is what it is, and it was a good book. And then the final book that I read in the month of October, finally, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which I gave 2 stars. This is a story published in the late 1800s about an alien invasion. Martians come to invade the countryside of England, and the main character basically just is there when the Martians invade, and it follows his story in like the couple of weeks after, and like what happened to him and what's going on. I don't know that he had a name. Throughout this whole book, I don't think he was named, and that was kind of just indicative of like what this was. Like, I didn't connect at all with the main character, and I didn't connect with the story, and there was nothing that like held my interest. It was kind of just like a fact-based account of like the aliens invading, and it was very dry. There were parts I really enjoyed, like towards the end, like the stuff with the aliens at the end was really, really interesting to me, and like not really what I expected, but so well done. And then there was a bit of emotional stuff in his personal life at the end, which I appreciated, because that was the one part where I was like, yes, I'm down for this. But like the rest of it was like just a lot of accounts of like basically battles between the humans and the aliens, and like I wasn't super interested in that. It was just kind of like dry and boring, and I found myself like I would be skimming, and then I would notice I was skimming and have to like go back and reread like a couple of pages, and it was just like kind of dull. Like, I was never really involved in this. I never really cared about it. I think if you're reading this from like a historical perspective of like looking at the history of the sci-fi genre, and if you're really interested in like what it meant at the time and what it means for the genre, you would probably enjoy it a lot more, because I know it's very important in that regard. But just like reading it to enjoy it, I got very little out of it. Not for me. But I thought about giving it 3 stars, but as I was thinking about it, I was like, the only reason I would be bumping it up from 2 to 3 stars was because I feel like it's an important book and it's a classic, and that's basically like lying to myself, because I didn't really enjoy it. I don't think it's terrible. There were things I liked about it, but it was just kind of like, I never really wanted to be reading it. And the only thing it really had going for it for me was that it was so short. It was really easy to get through. So, would recommend it if you're interested in like sci-fi as a genre and where it's come from, but like in general, I didn't think this was like that interesting. So that was everything that I read in October. This video is way too long, but that's okay. I mean, when you read 19 books, it's gonna be a long video. So let me know down below if you've read any of these, what you thought of them if you have, and what else you've read in October. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.